What's the plan? After 16 years in opposition with major scandals over Labor's donor developers and Wollongong corruption, and with communities across New South Wales up in arms over the power of the Minister for Planning to override their development controls, it emerged this week that the Coalition has no legislation prepared and ready for reform. In a public debate, Coalition Shadow Planning Minister Brad Hazzard could not produce draft legislation rewriting the planning laws ready to go when an O'Farrell government hits the ground running in the likely event of a change of government in 2 weeks' time. Mr Hazzard instead repeated the Coalition's commitment to an independent review of the planning laws. We still don't know who will carry out the review or the terms of reference. Yesterday, in a room full of property developers, architects and planners, Mr Hazzard and Planning Minister Tony Kelly debated their policy differences.
The planning system must have integrity. It must have transparency.
What you learn very quickly in planning is that change is too often resisted. That's partly why the New South Wales Government has worked to take decisions of state-significant projects away from local government.
The two-party planning spokesman, Labor's Tony Kelly and the Coalition's Brad Hazzard, head-to-head at a Property Council election debate on Thursday. On the morning of the debate, the front page of the Manly Daily newspaper shouted, "Welcome to Harrywood," in a tabloid splash to highlight the development of the Warriewood Valley on Sydney's northern beaches by Harry Triguboff's Meriton Corporation.
What happened here is an example of how developers under 3A don't have to play by the same rules that everybody else has to play under. What happened here destroyed orderly planning for the Warriewood Valley.
The Meriton development had been approved under the contentious Part 3A of the Planning Act, as has most of this development in the valley.
Council, after years of consultation with government and community, said there should be 30 dwellings per hectare on this land. Under 3A, the developer got 60 dwellings. We said 2 to 3 stories. Under 3A, the developer got 3 to 4 stories.
The Planning Minister says the approval was granted by the Planning Assessment Commission after rigorous merit assessment and rejects the Manly Daily's report.
What I would say about that is that the PAC, Planning Assessment Commission, which both the opposition want to beef up and the Greens want to have all the ministerial decisions made by PAC, it was actually PAC who approved that. It didn't come to me, so it was an independent body that made that approval, and my understanding is that they didn't approve any development on the floodplain. So I think the paper's wrong.
I think Warriewood is a classic example of what's wrong with Part 3A and why Part 3A has to go. The very fact that that development went to Part 3A shows that there's something fundamentally wrong with the system.
On top of Part 3A, there's the housing density issue, urban consolidation, that's code for blocks of flats built along transport corridors. Labor commits to 70% infill, urban consolidation, to 30% sprawl, new housing in outer suburban greenfield sites. The Coalition says it should be around 50-50.
Now, the government have been running around in the last few weeks saying, "Oh, woe is me, this is terrible, they're going to put more housing in Western Sydney." Heavens. The government actually said they were going to put 181,000 houses in the growth centres of Western Sydney. They're going to put 500,000 people there. So they know that's what's got to happen. So getting stuck into the Coalition is just an absolute furphy.
Planning became a red-hot political issue over the last 4 years. First, there was community distress emerging from Ku-ring-gai when the local council's powers were overridden by the Minister for Planning and the department. Heritage houses were being demolished to make way for blocks of flats to increase housing density.
It's the complete rape of Ku-ring-gai by the development lobby.
In 2008, corruption added to public scepticism about the integrity of the system when the Independent Commission Against Corruption used phone tap and covert surveillance powers to expose corrupt relationships between developers and Wollongong City Council planning officials. In September 2009, in the fallout from the murder of property financier Michael McGurk, it was revealed that the Labor Party's Graham Richardson was granted individual access to the Director-General of Planning, Sam Haddad, to lobby for some of the party's biggest donor developers. The ICAC later exonerated Mr Richardson and Mr Haddad. Mr Richardson was paid $5,000 a month plus GST for lobbying for property developers Roy and Ron Medich. The then Minister for Planning, Christina Keneally, defended Mr Richardson's activities.
In New South Wales, it is not illegal for people to make donations to political parties.
As Mr Richardson represents other clients, let's have a look at this slide. Why would these property developers need to retain Richo's services and pay all this money to the ALP as well?
You would have to ask them why they make that choice. That is their choice to make.
But such was the public concern about the relationship between the Labor Party and its slush-funding donor developers that at his party's 2009 state conference, then Premier Nathan Rees, without consultation with his caucus, announced that the Labor Party would no longer take money from developers.
From today, the New South Wales Labor Party will ban donations from developers. Not another cent.
Mr Rees lost his job a few weeks later, but the developer donations ban and other campaign finance reforms are now law.
The residents of this street have been barricaded in for the past 2 years.
In a just-released cinema documentary, State of Siege, by protest activist and filmmaker Dennis Grosvenor, the member for Ku-ring-gai, Barry O'Farrell, acknowledged that the heritage protections and community empowerment once available through the 1979 Environmental Planning and Assessment Act had been watered down through upper house deals over the decades, pushed by powerful vested interests.
And what we've seen in New South Wales under successive planning ministers and then successive premiers is a complete disrespect of the rights of local communities to decide local issues.
So change for the better is coming. But what change? At this week's public debate, we recorded this exchange with Brad Hazzard, who will be the next Minister for Planning in the likely event of a change of government in 2 weeks' time. Mr Hazzard, if you're the Minister, all you are, after the 26th, all you are offering this room and the people of New South Wales is a review of the planning system. After 16 years in opposition, I would have thought you and your colleagues would have had the legislation in draft form ready to go so everybody could see exactly what you're doing.
That's not what we're offering. No, you're wrong. What we're offering is that, first of all, Part 3A will go, and it will go very quickly. There is an absolute stench of corruption around this government, and unfortunately that has developed now over 16 years. If Part 3A was so wonderful for the development industry, then we would see far more development than is happening here in New South Wales at the moment. So it's neither good for the development industry, it is not good for the public, and it has to go. We've already announced that, and that's a major platform for the upcoming election.
Everybody
and what we'll
wants
also
to know what will replace it.
What we will also be doing, the issue, first of all, let me say, in the longer term, we will be having, as you correctly point out, a complete public review, which hasn't happened in regard to the Environmental Planning and Assessment Act. The Act itself is now 31 years old, and what we're going to do is we're going to make sure that these sorts of issues are dealt with upfront through a strategic planning process. There will be, in the new legislation, a new focus. Currently the Act has no requirement whatsoever, no connection with strategic planning. It is a Development Approval Act. It has nothing to do with strategic planning, and hence we have all these land use conflicts right around the state. That review will ensure that we have, after working with the industry, with all sections of the community and environmentalists, we'll make sure that we have an Act that for the first time actually has strategic planning in place, and as a result of that, you won't have these sorts of issues arising.
It's a question of timing, I suppose, that this would take 2 to 3 years. And
we're aiming, I mean, the planners are indicating to us that they thought it could take that time, and we've indicated that we think it can be done far quicker, and we'll have it done in 12 to 18 months.
Well, who is going to do the review?
That will be set up, obviously, in the fullness of time with collaboration with the industry, with the community. There will be representatives from all of the various players in New South Wales. What we need...
Is it an instrument, is it a judicial inquiry, or is it you'd be the minister, who would do the review and under what form? What statutory form?
We're looking at that at the moment, but what it will be is absolutely independent. So it won't be driven by politics, it'll be driven independently.
You're a fortnight away from the election and you can't tell us...
No, I can tell you. I can tell you that it will be driven independently.
The statutory form of the review.
It will be driven independently, and I think that at this point, that's the negotiation that will take place with the community, with the environment movement, with the developers and with others to ensure that there is a full transparency about that. Look, we are fair dinkum about overturning the stench of corruption in this government and what has happened in New South Wales, and it will be a full independent review.
I know I'm not supposed to ask questions, but it normally would take some 5 years to do that review. So what you're saying is on day one, throw out Part 3A and take 18 months, or as I suspect probably longer, 2 to 3 or 4 years, before you replace it with something. What happens to those $12 billion worth of investment, those 20,000 jobs a year, or 40,000 jobs a year that we currently approve now? Does this place just stop?
First of all, 5 years it might take under Labor. It certainly won't take that long under a coalition government.
And there's the biggest problem of all, a chronic undersupply of housing leading to extortionate rents and housing unaffordability.
The interesting thing is Victoria managed to maintain its supply during the GFC. All Sydney did was fall further and further behind, and there's no sign that we're lifting ourselves out of that trough.
Neither the Labor nor Liberal parties have given the public forecasts or projections on exactly how their planning policies will confront and overcome the undersupply and affordability crisis now identified as a New South Wales problem by the Reserve Bank and the Council of Australian Governments Reform Council, and by the Property Council's Glenn Byers.
Ultimately, what we need to do is get in place a long-term pipeline of supply that is zoned and serviced land, that delivers that trunk infrastructure, that builds the infrastructure that underpins the rollout of new communities and urban renewal. And we've got to be able to allow investors to come into the system and be treated efficiently and effectively to make sure their projects can get through and we can close that gap.
Community and investor confidence in the integrity and certainty of the planning system, that's the challenge.